And we want to thank Sister Ebony Adedayo in advance for being able to drop some of that knowledge on us tonight. And also thank you all for being present to hear that as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Ebony Adedayo, who is the founder and creator of the Aya Collective, a space that centers Black and African women and supports their writing practice. The Aya Collective does this by centering spirituality and sacred practices and convening opportunities for Black women to write in community with each other. Adedayo is also a doctoral student and at the University of Minnesota in curriculum and instruction, and she's minoring in culture and teaching in African American and African studies. Ebony has been a long time community member who has, worked in St. Paul and across the Twin Cities with our people and is well known. And she's no stranger to New School, has been attending New School since the early inceptions, along with Barbara Tope and her family. So we just thank you. We welcome you into this space, not just as a participant at this point, but as a teacher. So yes. We just want to welcome you, Ebony Adedayo, who will be presenting on titled Remembering Who We Are, a survey through Black feminist theories. So you can unmute yourself when you're ready.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Sister Shakita. I am so happy and appreciative to just be here and to just be with you all. As Shakita said, the title of my talk this evening is Remembering Who We Are, a survey through Black feminist theories. And I'm at the University of Minnesota, and there's one of my many email addresses. Can we advance to the next slide? So I just wanted to first start off with gratitude. Gratitude for being here, gratitude for being a part of this community over the last 4 or so years. I don't exactly know when we started or when I started, but I'm just appreciative to just be a part of this learning community that unapologetically centers Black thought, Black consciousness, Black liberation, and has been really meaningful in my own growth and development. And now having an opportunity to give back what you guys have already sown into me so much just feels really humbling. So thank you for that. Let's go to the next slide. So a little bit about me. I am a doctoral student entering my 4th year in curriculum instruction at the University of Minnesota. My minors are in culture and teaching and African American studies. I spent way more time in Afro than I have in culture and teaching for various reasons, but that's what I'm focusing on in my doctoral studies. I'm hoping to be ABD by January. We don't know if that will happen. Maybe it will, we'll see. I'm also an author and an entrepreneur. I am the recent author of The Gospel According to a Black Woman and Incomplete Stories on Lost Love and Hope. I'm also the founder of the Aya Collective and Aya Media Publishing LLC, which focuses on cultivating and promoting Black women's stories. And so that is a little bit about what I do. Let us jump into the meat and the heart of the presentation. We've already talked so much about what Black feminism is, and I've heard so many wonderful remarks. And I'm like, I don't need to teach anymore. We can just go home. But I feel like there's still a lot of misconceptions and just things that I think that we can talk about during our time together this evening. So let's go to the next slide. All right. So I want to start by addressing some long-held myths about what Black feminism is. I think a lot of time people get tripped up on the word for right reasons about what feminism is, believing that it's an invention of white women and that it originated from the West and it doesn't have anything to do with Black women. So I want to start off by addressing some of these myths, which we've kind of talked about a little bit, but I want to go a little bit deeper. Again, I feel like the concerns here are warranted because white feminism has never been down for Black women or for Black men. And a historic example, and Elder already mentioned When and Where I Enter. I remember reading this text a couple of years ago and learning about the suffrage movement and the role that white women played in undermining the progress of Black people, not just Black women. A quote that I wanted to read from the book, as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Staton show us, in trying to secure voting rights for women in the 20th century, sometimes those who speak on behalf of you can use their speech to undermine your own self-interest. When it looked like Black men would be given the right to vote before women, Anthony Staton and other white suffragists said that such a political move would not be in the best interest of Black women. And so white women said that giving Black men the vote would not be in the best interest for Black women. So I just want you to think about just the irony of that statement. Staton, a white woman, warned that if Black women weren't given the ballot, they would be fated to a triple bondage that man never knows. She went on as far as to conclude, it would be better to be a slave of an educated white man than of an ignorant Black one. So these are white women, white suffragists, white feminists who are stating that it would be better for Black women to be under slavery than to be married to an ignorant Black one who has the right to vote. And so when we say that feminism is about white women, feminism originates from the West, and even though that's a myth, it's warranted that we feel some type of way about feminism because of the ways in which white women worked against Black liberation, white women worked against the progress of the Black family and the Black community. The sentiments show the thinking of some white feminists. The good news is that Black feminism does not originate with white women, and it does not originate from the West. Some of you said that, after the civil rights movement, it came into being, and it was a response to a lot of the things that were happening and that white women were doing. But one of the things I want to remind us, there's this oft-quoted refrain from the late Audre Lorde, a queer Black feminist, that says the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I know many of us on this call are probably very familiar with that phrase, but we forget that many of the tools in the very house itself were stolen, appropriated, and used against us. And so I love the quote and I love the refrain, but in the context of feminism, I really want to trouble the phrase and really think about how feminism could be an ancient response to oppression derived from patriarchy, sexism, and homophobia, even if the language is more recent. Speaking to this very issue, scholar Bisola Adeleye Fayeyemi notes that Africa has the oldest civilizations in the world, and thus the oldest patriarchies and the oldest resistance to patriarchy. And so some of our African sisters on the continent recognize that prior to colonization, prior to enslavement, prior to Europe doing its whole messy thing to African people, that patriarchy has been in existence, and thus Black women have been fighting against patriarchy from the beginning. So I just want to center that in our consciousness, that it's not something that white women constructed. They may have constructed the word, but the theory, the essence, the embodiment of feminism predates a lot of our interactions with the European continent. Let's go to the next slide to unpack another myth. In the US context specifically, there has always also been Black women activists who've expressed how their sexual identity combined with their racial identity to make their whole life situation and the focus of their political struggle unique. And so that's another reason why we can understand that this myth that white women invented feminism, we give white people way too much credit, way too much. That white women invented feminism, that white people invented this word, that the West invented this word. We have to also remember Black women activists on our continent, on this continent in particular, have always fought against this. And so we've already talked about Anna Julia Cooper. We've talked about Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terwell, and so many others who have led the charge here. And not just them, I also want to center, as Shakita said, our great grandmothers and our sisters and our aunts who may not have been on the front lines in terms of scholarship or activism, but understood from the depth of their experience the unique barriers that they face on account of their race. And so once again, this concept of feminism, regardless of what you call it, the idea of pushing back against oppression because of race, because of gender, because of all of these other intersections is not new. Some of the language is a little bit more recent. Let's move on to the next slide. I also want to bring Sojourner Truth into the room. And so I feel like y'all were reading my slides prior to this because I wanted to talk about Ain't I Woman and her famous speech, where she also talks about the intersection of race and gender. In her address, she says, that man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lift over ditches and have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could feed me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most of them sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Sojourner Truth right here is speaking here to the realities that Black women face as a result of race and gender, addressing the peculiarities that befell Black women under slavery. Peculiarities that included not only forced labor and violence, which was also shared by Black men, like we struggled through that nonsense together, but Black women also endured rape, forced reproduction to uphold the institution of slavery, forced breastfeeding of white women's children where our own starved and died. And then we also had to watch our own children sold off. And so once again, Sojourner Truth, one of the many early activists in our community who understands that this is not, we have to fight against race and we have to fight against gender and we have to fight at the intersections. And so again, reifying the idea that this idea of feminism was not created by white women or the West. So that's one myth. Let's move on to the next slide. That's one myth. Another myth is the idea that Black feminism is about men bashing or men hating. Let's move on to the next slide. So I want to use some of our women, our feminist thinkers, our Black feminist thinkers to help push it back against that notion. So we've also talked about Alice Walker's definition of Black feminism, particularly in womanism. She wrote in her book, In Search of My Mother's Gardens, Our Mother's Gardens, this idea of what womanism is and how it differs from white women's ideas of feminism. She says in this text, a woman, Black feminism or womanism is a woman who loves other women, sexually and non-sexually. Sometimes Black women love other men sexually and non-sexually. The piece I really want to underscore here is that in her definition, she says that womanism is committed to the survival and wholeness of entire people. Let me say that again. Womanism is committed to the survival and wholeness of entire people. And so even though Alice Walker was talking about the oppression that Black women were facing as a result of racism and sexism and homophobia and some of those other things, she understood that our liberation is still tied to the liberation of Black people. So she was not about separatism, except for momentarily for the sake of wellness, which is another part of her definition. I want to move on to this piece from the Combahee River Collective. And these were a group of Black women who, after the civil rights movement, were thinking about how they could center. And so we often credit Kimberly Crenshaw for the idea of intersectionality, but intersectionality really comes into play in the Combahee River Collectives and their work, which predated Kimberly Crenshaw for about by 20 years or so. And so in their work, they're saying, although we are feminists and we are lesbians, we feel solidarity with progressive Black men and do not advocate for the separation that white women who are separatists demand. We struggle together with Black men against racism, while we also struggle with Black men about sexism. And so both Walker and our sisters in the Combahee River Collective understood and understand the importance of articulating the unique oppression Black women experience, and also emphasize the importance, the need to continue to do this work alongside Black men to advance Black liberation. Neither Walker or the Combahee River Collective or many other Black feminists advocate for the separatism, but specificity and accountability. And so we're advocating for, let's be specific about the oppression. Let's name it. Let's identify it. It's complex. It's varied. Let's put a name to it. And also advocating for accountability. Accountability because we can't attain Black liberation if half of our community is suffering under gender-based violence and lack of regard. And so that's really what Black feminism is about. Another long-held myth, can we go to the next slide? Another long-held myth is that focusing on sexism is divisive and a distraction from focus on race. Though this is a pervasive myth, so many have understood that this is not the case, including, again, Audre Lorde, who, reflecting on the movement work from the 60s, where Black male leadership was very strong, stated that for Black folks, any move for liberation has to be complex. For Lorde, unity does not mean unanimity. Unity implies the coming together of elements which are, to begin with, varied and diverse in their particular natures. Our persistence in examining the tensions within diversity encourages growth toward a common goal. And so for Lorde, we can be unified, and we can be diverse, and we can have diverse needs, and we don't have to parse out and force ourselves into these single issue fights. Additionally, and I want to bring Du Bois into the room, a scholar who I love and adore, who wrote The Souls of Black Folks. He stated that the problem of the 20th century would be the color line. He said that in The Souls of Black Folks. But in an essay called The Damnation of Women, which is in Darkwater that he wrote sometime later, he articulated the experience of Black women and stated that the uplift of women is next to the problem of the color line in the peace movement, our greatest modern cause. When, how two of these movements, women and color, combine in one, the combination has deep meaning. And so I feel that's really important, that Du Bois, who's saying the color line is the most important problem of the 20th century, and is also saying that we also have to take care of this idea of how we're treating Black women. And I would recommend reading the essay. It's very, very short. It's a couple of pages long. And he goes on to unpack how Black women are being untreated fairly, and how we are bearing the brunt of a lot of the different, like I talked about, the rape and the mass reproduction of Black community in order to uphold slavery. He's talking about all these things in this essay. And the book is really, really tiny, but this essay is even tinier. So I would recommend folks will get it and read it to really have a better understanding of what Du Bois is trying to say here. I also want to go to the work of Patricia Hills Collins and her work, The Black Feminist Thought. She notes how several Black men scholar activists have really also centered not only the problem of the color line, but also this need to eradicate sexism. So she notes that Manning Marble devotes an entire chapter to unpacking how sexism has been a primary deterrent to Black community development. She also names Haki Madhubuti, Cornel West, Michael Eric Dyson, among others, who recognize the importance of taking Black feminist thought seriously. For me, this means that we have to consider how much the push on single issues without an intersectional lens actually comes from outside of our community, by people who are not genuinely interested in Black liberation. So when you have this many folks who are devoted to Black liberation, this many scholars, I'm led to believe that we've been duped, and we've been forced to focus on single issues at our own expense. And so I want us to think about how we can break out of that framework. And as we think about it, let's start talks. I've told you what Black feminism is not, right? So I want to talk about what Black feminism is. Let's move to the next slide. Drawing again from Collins' work, her Black feminist thought work, she surveys a wide range of Black women thinkers and intellectuals, including early Black feminists like Cooper and Sojourner Truth and Anna Julia Cooper. So all these wonderful women that we've already named and brought in the room. Collins surveys their work to come up with a definition of what Black feminist thought is. She states that recognizing the intersections of Black women's subordination across race, class, gender, sexuality, and nation, that the overarching purpose of Black feminist thought is to resist oppression, both its practices and ideas that justify it. Its aim is to empower African-American women within the context of social injustice sustained by intersecting oppressions. Since Black women cannot be fully empowered unless intersecting oppressions themselves are eliminated, Black feminist thought supports broad principles of social justice that transcend U.S. Black women's particular needs. And so she's saying that Black women cannot reach, enjoy, even begin to realize liberation unless we address the intersecting oppressions. And so I would argue that as Black people, we can't even begin to realize liberation unless we address those oppressions that Black women and other marginalized identities within our community are experiencing. One of the things I like about Patricia Hill Collins and so many other Black feminists is that she's drawing on different theories, right? So she's drawing on different theories to construct this overarching thought of what Black feminist thought is. But what I know and what I understand is that, again, the idea of unanimity. So we're coming together to help construct this idea of what Black women are experiencing, the uniqueness of our particular oppressions. But they take different shape, they take different forms. And so even though our experiences are similar, even though there's a lot of similarities between what we as Black women experience here in the US and even on the continent and throughout the rest of the diaspora, there are still theorists, there's still activists who designate different particularities around some of these theories. And so I want to unpack some of them in our hearing today. And so I want to make sure we're on the next slide. Can we go to the next slide? I want to talk about the different forms of Black feminism that have emerged. And by no means is this list exhaustive. These are just some of the ones that I have worked the most with over the last several years. We've already talked about womanism, but I'll talk about it again here, because I also want to talk about not only the idea of womanism, but womanist theology in particular. A lot of womanist theologians, in looking at James Cone, if people are familiar with him, he's now late. I believe he passed away in 2017 or 2018, who was kind of like the premier founder of Black liberation theology. Many Black women coming into the church who wanted to be scholars and theologians and pastors recognized that James Cone's, his framework was inclusive of race, but again, was not including the Black woman experience. And so these theologians, people like Katie G. Cannon, people like Jacqueline Grant, some of these early womanist theologians, they looked at Alice Walker's text and they began to put together a theology based on her text, because they saw in what Alice Walker was doing something that they could begin to relate to the experiences of Black women in the church. And so Black womanist theology, it articulates the experiences of Black women from a theocentric framework, pushing back against white heteropatriarchal doctrines that have confined Black women. In this tradition, Shanika Walker Barnes, a womanist theologian and psychologist who is really, really great. I recommend getting her book, Too Heavy a Yoke, as well as her idea about reconciliation. She critiques the theology of suffering that has been attached to Black women that have been upheld by many institutions, including the Black church. For Shanika Walker Barnes, as well as other womanist theologians, this theology leaves many Black women believing that suffering and being a good Christian or a good woman or a good mother, a good worker go hand in hand. While Walker Barnes is describing the experience of Black church women, this theology of suffering is pervasive across institutions where Black women are called on to attend to the well-being of others while neglecting our own needs. And we think about how this shows up in government, we think about how this shows up in academia, we think about how this shows up in community, in the home, and we understand that regardless if Black women are Christian or not, this theology, this expectation that you will suffer, that you will grin and bear it, is attached to our being and who we are. Citing a 2004 article by Renita Weems, another womanist theologian who I just love, Walker Barnes states that a large number of African-American women believe that a good woman is a self-sacrificing woman, one who takes up her crown and endures suffering and abuse because they believe that to do so was natural, virtuous, even glorious. Moreover, the societal pressure to be a strong Black woman is the benefit of male structures throughout the rest of society. And so that's what Shanika Walker Barnes is talking about. That's what womanist theology, and that was a really quick snippet of what womanist theology is, but it really connects to Alice Walker's idea of womanism. So I wanted to show you the through line there. Another form of Black feminism, and I'm not sure if she would even consider herself a feminist, but I want to bring her name into the room. Africana womanism is a term coined by Hudson Weems in direct criticism of Walker's work, believing that gender is not the primary struggle for equity and recognition. Hudson Weems believed that Africana womanism more succinctly captures the family-centeredness in an African framework rather than the female-centeredness of Western feminism, which I think is a misread of Black feminist work in epistemology, quite frankly. Though her work is a critique of walkers, with Walker, she also affirms the need for Black men and women to come together to fight against oppression. And so the reason I mention Hudson Weems is because it's another theoretical framework. But I do think she gets tripped up on the idea of feminism and feminism being rooted in whiteness in a Western way of being. Because as I go through Black feminist work, and when I go through what Black feminists are saying, I'm not seeing the same things that Hudson Weems is saying that we're doing. The issue, and I also want to talk about the issues of naming as well. The issues of naming, as Dillard suggests, and we'll talk about Cynthia Dillard a little bit more, are ultimately about defining and constructing the boundaries and the possibility for relationships across Black feminisms, across racial, tribal, ethnic, and national differences, as well as advocating for fundamental human rights. And so even though there's diversity within these different frameworks of Black feminism, we have to name it. We have to put a context and a framework around it to understand what we're talking about. So these are some of the frameworks of Black feminism that reside in the US context. There are also frameworks around Black feminism that tie into the continent. A lot of this from West African women who are thinking about these things. So Stalinism is rooted in the experiences of women in Africa as opposed to the diaspora. Motherism expands the focus on women in Africa by entrusting real women with the task of nurturing society, which I think is really, really beautiful, because you're bringing women who may not necessarily have access to the academy, to different type of discourse, centering their needs and their experience. Feminism, the concept of transcendence, stresses the female body in the raw as a site of feminist discourse. Neo-feminism and Snelson's feminism is hinged on the tripod of gender inclusion and collaboration, expanding the tenets of womanism. So those are just a few that exist on the continent. I want to go back to the idea of naming. Let's go to the next slide. The importance and limitations of naming. So we talked about how it's important to name things, right? It's important to have a framework. It's important to have some language around things. Collins, and we've already talked about her a little bit, she recognizes, despite the fact that African American women face common challenges, that it doesn't mean that we each have the same experience or agree on the impact of or meaning of those experiences. So Collins states that the existence of core themes does not mean that African American women respond to these themes in the same way. And so that's one of the things that I see Hudson Weems doing with Walker's definition. She is responding to Walker's definition in a different way. I may not necessarily agree with where she's coming from, but I appreciate her scholarship and her desire to stake a place for herself and her thought in what Black feminism is. Dillard, who we'll talk about as we start to talk about Endarkened Feminism, she also shows us that any attempt at naming and renaming feminism is inclusive of some and exclusive of other experiences. So anytime we try to universalize our experience in our definitions, we will always leave some people out. And so it's important to name, and there are limits in name. And with that, I want to name one of the theories that I spend a lot of my time working around in Endarkened Feminist Epistemology. And I've been talking about Cynthia Dillard, but now I'm going to really talk about her because she's one of my favorite scholars. So favorite that I asked her to be on my dissertation committee, and she can't because she's doing the most. But let's go to the next slide so we can talk about Endarkened Feminist Epistemology. This is another form of Black feminism. It explains how reality is known when placed in the context of global Black feminist thought. Endarkened means Black and dark-skinned women, and so to darken something. And so that's what it's talking about. In epistemology, referring to the way that we think and know, how Black women know. Endarkened feminist epistemology is an approach to research that honors the wisdom, the memory, spirituality, and critical interventions of transnational Black women's ways of knowing and being in research, with the sacred serving as a way to describe the way of doing it. the way that we approach the work, an understanding, or rather a conviction, that spirituality and the sacred are embedded in our inquiry, our knowledge, and our cultural production as Black women, and that understanding this connects us to the activism of Black women globally. Why globally? And this is one of the reasons I also appreciate Cynthia Dillard. She's centering the Black in the US context in her work, but she's also trying to connect us to the ways in which Black women show up across the globe. It's important for her because the common themes of struggle and spirituality shared through Black feminisms within Africa, the US, and the diaspora that include struggles for group survival, institutional transformation, the recognition of women's rights, and our fight against global white supremacy, because global white supremacy doesn't just take shape here in the US, but it is a phenomenon that has been exported across the globe. Let's go to the next slide so we can unpack Dillard's framework a little bit more. She has 6 assumptions that she believes undergirds Endarkened Feminist Epistemology. Again, her scholarship is rooted in spirituality and the sacred. And so a lot of her framework is still tied to that. So for the first one, self-definition for one's participation and responsibility to one's community. That's how we're defining ourselves. The second piece, researching is both an intellectual and a spiritual pursuit, a pursuit of purpose. We'll unpack that one a little bit later. The third one, only within the context of community does the individual appear and through dialogue continue to become. See, this is why I love Dillard, because she's so community-centered. She's so Black-centered. She cares about us. Again, she underscores the idea that we're not trying to do this thing of Black feminism away from the context of the larger Black community. 4, concrete experience within everyday life form the criterion of meaning, the matrix of meaning making. Let's move on to the next slide. Knowing and research are both historical, extending backward in time and outward to the world. To approach them otherwise is to diminish their cultural and empirical meaningfulness. Number 6, power relations manifest as racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on. And they structure gender, race, and other identity relations within research. EFE, the shorthand for Endarkened Feminist Epistemology, is aligned within African traditions and uses narratives and life notes to communicate Black women's experiences. So that's part of her framework. Let's move on to the next slide. Another piece of Dillard's framework with EFE is this idea of remembering, and remembering who we are, remembering what we've been seduced to forget. And she has a really beautiful framework and an article that I can maybe send around later that I've drawn on a lot over the years. And I'll talk about it a little bit today, but it is definitely worth reading. Here I want to talk about how we have been seduced to uphold the material world over the spiritual world. And I've already said that the way that Black women know, the way that Black people know is through spirit, through culture, through our sacred traditions and our ceremonies. But Dillard says that because of the way that our own knowledge systems have been discarded and trampled on by the West, we can sometimes operate in ways where we pursue scientific objectivity in order to be legible to white. In the process, we abandon our spiritual and cultural practices that have sustained us generation after generation. And so what you end up getting is a compartmentalization where, I did not say that word right. We end up compartmentalizing who we are as Black women, as Black people. We might do church and mosque over here. We might do the academy over here. We might do work over here. We might do home over here. And we're never bringing those things in those ways of being together, because we want to be able to have our work approved. We want to be able to have our research validated. We want to be able to make sure that as our children are going through school, that they're not awkward and they're not weird. And so we're parsing out these pieces of ourselves in order to fit in. Reflecting on this with her experience in higher education, there's this beautiful book that reflects on Dillard's framework. It's called Black Feminism in the Academy, and it's edited by Bettina Love, who's another one of my favorite authors. I have a lot of scholars who are my favorites. Like, people have like celebrity crushes. I have scholar crushes. But in this book, Kira Shadid writes, The academy was so hostile to my spiritual self, my gendered self, my race self. I entered that classroom not knowing that the experiences of confusion and uncertainty I was having were deliberately created. Although I knew that a sense of spirituality was a decreed lifeline of the African American community, it seemed that one had to conceal working from the spiritual center to be an academic. And I've experienced that. I forgot to tell you to move on to the, oh no, this is right. This is the right slide. I'm sorry. I've experienced that type of restriction in the academy. I've also experienced it working across different institutions. I want to underscore again, spirituality is the way that Black women know. I'm not talking is one of the ways that some Black women know, many Black women know, not all Black women, but I do believe that is an experience that is common to the bulk of us. So I'll say that without trying to generalize, because again, naming, right? I'm not talking about a religious or a faith experience, so that definitely applies here, but it's bigger than a doctrine and more about the interconnectivity to higher power, a sense of intuition by which we order our lives that again is sustained by ritual, ceremony, and being in community with others. And these are some of the things that undergird what Dillard is talking about in her framework. Let's move on to the next slide. I already kind of spilled the beans and said that I have experienced, and not just me, all Black women, right, that exist in the soil, that navigate different institutions. And if we're not in institutions of higher ed or working for government or doing other things, wherever we end up working, we experience this force to compartmentalize who we are. We're seduced to forget our way of knowing through spirit. And it doesn't just happen in higher education, as I said. I wanted to reflect on my years working in government and wrote this piece some time ago, right after Thurman Blevins was killed. I believe that was in 2018. I was working for the city of Minneapolis. I was working within, and I still work there, hopefully not too long ago by the grace of God, but I was working within the Division of Race and Equity and was freaking out about like how much I was forced to silence what I was experiencing because of a Black brother was shot, and how much I was forced to perform in a certain way. And I just had to, I sat down and I began to pen these words because I felt like I could not come and be my authentic Black self who's totally grounded in a spiritual practice. And so I wrote these words. The spirit left at 9 o'clock and walked me to the door and begged me not to leave her. But there was no place for her inside. They would kill her inside. I will be back at 5 p.m. And then we will walk and play, and I will take you to the lake and we can run around. We'll eat and stay up late, way past our bedtime, laughing on the couch until we fall asleep. Okay, the spirit obliged, and I went in. I rushed through the day a lesser version of myself, but I survived. That's been my experience. That has been my experience for a very long time until I started standing up and getting in trouble, which is a whole nother story because I started standing up. But before I did this, I felt so dry. I felt so empty in these spaces because I didn't feel like I could bring my whole self. I didn't feel like I could bring these spiritual practices. I didn't feel like I could bring these cultural practices. I have felt that way within the place that I've worked. I have felt that way in higher education. I felt that way even within the church. And I have a background working in the church too. And so I've even felt that way too within different religious institutions where I can't bring all of me in order to be legible to a white way of being, and decided long ago that I would stop doing that. But that's an experience that so many different Black women share. Let's move on to the next slide. Because we're not only seduced to forget the spirit, we're not only seduced to forget the sacred and to privilege the material way of knowing over the spiritual, we're also seduced to forget our way of knowing that connects to culture and back to the continent of Africa. We are seduced to forget our origins, that we have been disconnected for so long that we don't know the language, that we don't know the customs, that it is no longer our home and we can't connect back to it. However, it is important to understand that these are our roots, because Africa, regardless of how long we've been separated from it, it remains a lifeline for us. Says Amira Millicent Davis, Africa as material and metaphoric mother is the ground from which Black women emerge as a way to open a way for relevant cultural connections and reciprocal possibilities for African people to address the very nature of domination and oppression of Black feminist and African-centered thought in Indigenous cultural ways of knowing and being through engaging Indigenous and healing methodologies. And so for Davis, for Dillard, another scholar who I love, who connects back to the continent in her writing is Doris Tolliver, another Black feminist. These folks are helping us remember that it is necessary, it is important to connect back to the continent, to go back to the continent. That's one of the reasons why I absolutely love the work that Dr. Artika Tyner is doing right now in centering the continent and centering the need, the importance of us to connect back to it, whether we are turning momentarily, we are making a long-term transition. That is absolutely necessary for us to begin to center the continent in our thought, in the way that we do scholarship, in the way that we do community. It helps, let's move to the next slide. Going back to the continent, as I've said, Endarkened Feminism is about remembering. It's about remembering things that we have forgotten. It's about remembering things that are sometimes harmful, that feel harmful to remember because of the pain that we endured during those different things. Going back to the continent helps us to remember. It's not always pretty. When we begin to look through the archives of what really went down, one of the books I read but a year ago, for a class that I had, what was it called? Oh, Losing Your Mother by Saidiya Hartman. Harrowing book, right? It's really hard to face some of the stories that Saidiya Hartman talks about in this book in her returning to the continent. But even when it's hard to look through these archives and understand that things are so messy and so complex, and that some of our people were complicit in what ended up happening to us, and some people are still complicit, that we have to go back and look for ourselves. I liken it to, for those of you who are familiar with the biblical text, in the book of Nehemiah, the prophet goes back and he's like, I need to go back and look at Jerusalem for myself in order to rebuild these walls. And so for me, the experience of going back to Africa, going back for whether it's short-term, long-term, connecting to the continent overall, is likened to the experience of Nehemiah, going back and looking out the walls for yourself to see the destruction, to see the amazement, and to begin to understand how we can connect back to it. And this is one of the reasons I decided to go in 2019 for the year return. Though I had been on the continent 12 years prior in 2007, I knew that this particular experience would be important for my spiritual development. In the airplane on the ride to Ghana, right as we were about to pass over North Africa, I penned these particular words. You ordained this moment for me, God, from the beginning of time. You knew my ancestors would cross the Atlantic 400 years ago. You knew that I would look white supremacy and racism squarely in the face and declare these forces of evil powerless. You knew I would be doing this work for the city of Minneapolis. The time has come for our healing and our deliverance. And I believe we have to reconnect with the place of our origins in order to find that rest. If we are connected to the land, if the land is a living, breathing, life-producing thing, we have to reconnect back to it. The spirit of our ancestors long for that rest. We have to get back to that land. After 400 years, I'm here to bring my ancestors who long for that day. I remember those who left, not knowing where they were going, but knowing that they would be leaving the only place they knew. I'm going for them, and so that I can move forward with remembering, bringing into consciousness who we were before slavery, so we could have a much more adequate understanding of who we are and what we are building into the future. Let's move on to the next slide. I believe that it was in the going and utilizing Dillard's remembering process, specifically through researching and revisiting, recognizing, representing, and reclaiming. Like, she has all of these beautiful models. Y'all have to look her up. She's the bomb. I believe doing this work of remembering and just doing this research. One of the things I did prior to going, like, I've been writing this book, Incomplete Stories, for years, and began to trace just my grandmother and trying to remember who she was, right? And so she developed Alzheimer's when my daughter was quite young. I think she was maybe a year old or so. she began to kind of like lose who she was as a result of that. And I knew I had to pin her story and begin to write things down. And so I believe that it was through my own work of remembering, going back to the continent, going back and reclaiming and researching and revisioning that ultimately prepared me for my grandmother's transition in 2020. And I also had her in mind when I was in Ghana. So like, as I was in Ghana, one of the things I did is I took copious notes of everything. And so I wish that I would have sat a little bit more and observed a little bit more and just allowed the spirit to flow a little bit more, but I didn't want to miss anything. So I was taking, and I'm a note taker by nature, and so it kind of makes sense, but I was taking notes of everything. And so I was also reflecting on my grandmother and who she was, and just trying to make sense of our family story. And so, as I mentioned, I believe doing that work prepared me for her transition. And as I was writing a paper for class, actually an autoethnography on my time in Ghana, and she passed right in the middle of me writing that paper. And so I wrote this poem to her, just to remember who she was, to remember that she finally has an opportunity to go home, not just to her heavenly home, but I believe going back to rest on that land. So I wrote this piece to her. We may have left, but the spirit never left us. The ancestors have continued to guide us, separated by land and sea. They are only a whisper away. Some by boat, others by plane, most through death. We all have a way of returning, of going through the door, resting on the land our ancestors birthed us. Enjoy your rest. So that was a piece that I wrote to her. She was a love of my life. She was something special. Yeah, and so I think about her often in my own remembering work. It's so important to, even though I don't have access to all of those histories and all of those memories, because she is no longer with us in the side of the living and is an ancestor now, I believe it's just so important to connect with her. And that's the premise of, Endarkened Feminist Epistemology. That's the premise of Black feminist thought, I believe, is connecting to those things that are sacred, that are meaningful to us. Let's move to the conclusion, because I know I probably went over time. Black feminist theories help us look deeper to address the intersections of oppression related to race, gender, sex, ability, and class. In order to realize Black liberation, we cannot leave anyone in our community behind. And so we need to be intentional about addressing the needs of Black women and holding systems and people accountable for the ways in which we continue to endure oppression at the intersections of race, gender, sex, class, ability, nationality, and all of the isms. In so doing, we will not only close gaps created by gendered racism and misogyny, which is the hatred of Black women, but we will also come that much closer to understanding the pieces of us that we've either been forced or seduced to forget because of colonization and slavery. Black feminist theories like Endarkened Feminist Epistemology puts us in touch with the remnants of ourselves that are still there and that are just waiting to be tapped into. And so it's a theory that supports and undergirds Black women in our liberation. But when we begin to open it up, the things that Dillard is talking about in terms of being connected back to the land, in terms of being connected back to our spirituality, it benefits all of us. And that's why Black feminist thought, that's why Black feminist theory really is deeply connected to Black liberation. It's not on the side of, it's not in addition to, it's a necessary component in order for us to actually realize the liberation that we desperately need. Let's move to the next slide. So I'm done. These are some of the books I have written where I go into the remembering process. Incomplete Stories on Lost Love and Hope is probably the one that is most closely to that. Again, I wrote that as a love letter to my grandmother. Also, my autoethnography from my time in Ghana is in the middle of the book. And then at the end of the book is a sermon that I preached a couple months ago about remembering, and then the gospel according to Black women. And so you can find out more about that at immediapublishingllc.com, and you can get a discount for ordering as well. Let's move to the next slide. And we also have a writing, the Aya Collective, the space that I convene, also has a writing event coming up tomorrow we have Sacred Saturdays at 8 a.m., the last Saturdays of the month. And so feel free to go to ayacollectivemn.com, # blog, in order to find out more about our writing community. So that's it. Thank you so much for having me, giving me the opportunity to present something that's really special to me. And so I'm done. Thank you.
Wow.
Wow is not enough.
Yep.
Wow is not
Oh my
enough.
goodness.
Oh, wait, that's not what I got to say. Oh, wait.
Yes.
Elder has something to say, y'all. Hold on.
Girl.
Ebony Adedayo. In the name of my grandmother. It's simple but profound. God bless you, child. CHILE. God bless you, child. You understand? I have nothing more to say. It's one of the most brilliant exposés that I have ever heard on feminism. I haven't heard everything, but you included some dimensions that I had not thought of. And that's good. That's why I have so much confidence in you young people. You're smarter. You're going to be braver. You're not there yet. I think the people in the past were braver than us, slaves. But you're not far behind. This third wave of our struggle, that's what you were part of. You know, I don't have anything else to say. It's one of the most incredibly incisive things I've ever heard about us. And the whole thing about being seduced to forget.
Yeah.
You know, Malcolm X and his everyday language, you talk about Black people, you don't want to hear about Africa. That's where you left your mind, in Africa. You said that in so many words. So thank you.
Yes.
All praise is due to you. You're sitting on an intellectual and spiritual gold mine. I think you are. I mean, I've never heard anything like that. Not the dimensions that you covered. I've heard a few feminists, and I consider myself a feminist, incidentally. And you know what I mean by that. That I'm a feminist. I have to be as philosophical as political. That's the way a male can be a feminist as much as any woman. It's got nothing to do with sex so much as the role that you play in society. So I thank you, my God. You're sitting on a gold mine, an intellectual gold mine, and you're being so modest about it.
Yep.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Ebony.
Yeah.
And there are a few comments, and I'm trying to search to see where the questions are, but a few people are saying like that was a beautiful tribute to your grandmother, or another person who said they are in tears. Beautiful. Yeah, and I think we do have a question that we will ask and before we go into the larger group discussion. It's from Sister Ngia. Do you want to unmute yourself to ask, or do you want me to ask that question?
You can read it. There's 3 in the chat. So I'll try to repost the other questions.
Perfect. So first question, how do you see men of African descent, Black men, responding to and interacting with this knowledge of Endarkened epistemology centering Black women?
That's a really good question. I think Black men should support it. And so, I mean, I heard elders say that he is a feminist. I've heard other Black men say that they are feminists as well. And I think one of the biggest ways that you can do that is to begin to support and lift up the testimony and the things that Black women are saying, and taking those truths as gospel, that an undisputed gospel. And so to support it. And also to connect to it, because again, I mentioned that, so some of the seductions don't just apply to Black women, they also apply to us as a people across the board. And so we have to collectively remember our spiritual practices. We have to collectively remember our connection to the continent. We have to collectively remember the things that we have been seduced to forget. the way that women remember through spirituality, through sacred practice, is one way. And I think by working in community in conjunction with each other, instead of silencing our voices because they're diverse, and because they're diverse is one way that we can do that. Again, understanding that fighting against sexism is not a distraction from fighting against racism, that we have to hold both of them together.
Okay. And there's another question by Brother Brian, which says, what gets in the way of us centering Black feminist theories in our quest?
No, those are that's the post-lecture questions.
Sorry. Those are I'm about to say, thank you. Jump in there. Those are the post, because I didn't see post-lecture questions there. But let's see. Are there any other, because they said there was 3 questions in the chat. So if y'all see any, please let me know, or unmute yourself if you have a question.
I don't have a question, but I would like to say, I posted this. Of all the going on 6 years of New Skool, this has impacted me in a very, very deep way. And I feel like it's one of the most profound things that we have heard. As Elder was saying, it's just brilliant. And I mean that. I'm in tears too, almost. Whoever posted that, I'm almost in tears. I'm in tears. It's like going deep into my spirit, into my belly. You know what I mean? Like it's like medicine that we need to try to understand what is really happening, and you're showing us, and people have been doing this work. It's a collective, it's a cumulative work, that you're presenting to us. It's not just your words, but it's all the words that have come before you. But this is like something that's going to sit on my head and my heart for a very long time. And I feel like it's a key to liberation, because when you describe the parts of your spirit not being able to enter into this place because it will be killed, it's exactly the thing that I just said when George Floyd died. And then I started to really realize that all this time in my workplace, even though I thought I was showing up fully, I realized that I was leaving about 17 of myself in the car. You know how your mom used to say, y'all can't come in here, you got to stay in the car, and I'll be right back. That I did that every single day of my life, going into a place where I thought I was being who I was, but I really wasn't. And it's almost like what you described is that there's really no place that Black women are allowed to be their full selves, not even sometimes in our own homes, in our own families. So thank you.
Thank you, Sister Gia.
I have a question. So it's so interesting, your Sacred Saturdays. Can anyone come?
Yep, any Black woman.
Yeah.
Come on. Yeah.
Okay, good. And so it's a writing session, or?
Yeah, it's a writing session, and so it's just real casual. We'll do a kind of a grounding activity, and then you either bring up an essay you're working on, or you can journal, or you can do whatever else during that writing time. So it was really laid back. And Sister Ngia says she'll post the link.
Thank you.
I just have a comment, Sister Ebony. Thank you for the informative presentation. It was amazing to just hear some of those historical components / facts and the everyday struggle of Black women. I guess my question to you is that how can Black men, i.e. African men, or just men in general, support Black women? Because now, and I'm gonna speak specifically from the African men perspective, it's like there are some stereotypes out there about African men or Black men in general not fully supporting Black women. So what recommendation would you put out there to support Black women in general, whether at a workplace, home, anywhere, any space.
Believe us. Believe us. Believe us when we talk about our experience. Believe us when we talk about our hurt. Believe us when we talk about our joys too. Yeah, believe us. Yeah, I wrote The Gospel According to Black Woman and published that in 2020 because I was really interested in centering the Black woman experience, our voice, our epistemology, the way that we view the world, not necessarily from a religious perspective, and really wanting to reclaim the word gospel to talk about like, this is the truth. This is the truth according to a Black woman, and it's valid and it's enough and it's powerful. But so often our truth is invalidated. So often our truth is exploited. Sometimes our words are taken and twisted to validate somebody else's opinion and belief system. And we end up being oppressed at the end of the day. And so I feel like at face value is to believe us, to honor us, to respect us. Yep. For me, that's it. That's where it starts.
Thank you.
So I believe it's another question from T. Nix, and maybe this will be the last question before we transition to the larger post discussion. Do you want to ask it or do you want me to read it off?
You can go ahead.
Okay. What is it like to see your legacy transforming us?
Teresa, I love that question and I love you for it. It's humbling because I do the work because it's important to me, and I don't always understand the impact that it has or see the impact that it has. I do it because I want to be well. I do it because I want to get set free and I want to free my children. And I do it because of my grandmother, and I do it because of my family and the struggles that they have went through. And so like, that's my commitment. And I don't always see or understand the impact that it has outside of that. So thank you.
Thank you. My goodness. Now I'm full up and I'm going to just write. Here I come.
So the two links are in the chat. You should click on them and then you'll open up to be able to register for her Sacred Saturdays, Black Women Writing. If you are interested in that, there's one tomorrow, and then every fourth Saturday, it looks like. And then the other, the website is also posted. So you just go to the chat and click on that, and you'll be able to have those as a resource, whoever wants to know about those two things.
Yes. Thank you, Sister Angia, for making that announcement. And thank you again, Sister Ebony, for dropping the knowledge, as I knew you're going to do that. And Elder said it's more than dropping the knowledge. But thank you so much for gracing us with that. And as always at New School, we gotta keep it moving. We gotta talk about, now that we have this knowledge, like, what does this mean? What does this mean in terms of connected to Black liberation? So there are some post discussion questions, which Brother Brian had posted, and then I think Sister Angia probably posted again, that we will be talking about in our smaller groups in the breakout rooms. So the first one is, what gets in the way of us centering Black feminist theories in our quest for Black liberation? And then how can we move forward? How can we move forward? Those are the two questions that we will be discussing in our breakout rooms.